So tonight we have John Coetzee, Cate Kennedy and David Malouf reading. 3 great writers in one unique evening. Each of these extraordinary writers will read one of their short stories in its entirety. My job is simply to keep the stories flowing. So I'd like to introduce our first guest tonight. JM, or John Coetzee, is a novelist, essayist, linguist and translator, and was the first author to win the Man Booker Prize twice. His latest novel is The Childhood of Jesus, and his latest book is a collection of short stories called 3 Stories. Tonight, John Coetzee will read A House in Spain from 3 Stories. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. I haven't worked very much in the medium of the short story. A House in Spain dates from 12 or 13 years ago and was first published in a journal called Architectural Digest. As he gets older, he finds himself growing more and more crabby about language, about slack usage, falling standards. Falling in love, for instance. We fell in love with the house, friends of his say. How can you fall in love with a house when the house cannot love you back, he wants to reply. Once you start falling in love with objects, what will be left of real love, love as it used to be? But no one seems to care. People fall in love with tapestries, with old cars. He would like to dismiss it, this neologism, this novelty, but he cannot. What if something is being revealed to him, some shift in the way people feel? What if the soul, which he had thought of was made of timeless substance, is not timeless after all, but is in the process of growing lighter, less serious, accommodating itself to the times? What if falling in love with objects is no oddity any longer for the soul? Child's play, in fact. What if people around him do indeed feel, with the aid of their new, updated souls, in respect of real estate, the ache that he associates with falling in love? What, furthermore, if his own crabbiness expresses not what he tells himself it does, an old-fashioned fastidiousness about language, but on the contrary, he looks the idea squarely in the face, envy, the envy of a man grown too old, too rigid to ever fall in love again. The story of his own involvements with fixed property is easily told. In his lifetime, he has owned serially 2 houses and an apartment, plus, for a while, in parallel, a seaside cottage. In all that history, he can recollect nothing by a long chalk that he would grace with the name of love. In fact, he can recollect little feeling at all, either when he took possession or when he moved out. Once he had put a house behind him, he became quite incurious about its fate. More than incurious, he wanted never to see it again. Functional from beginning to end, his understanding of the ownership relation. Nothing like love, nothing like marriage. He thinks about the women in his life, about his 2 marriages in particular. What does he still bear with him, within him, of those women, those wives? Tangles of emotion for the most part, regret and sorrow pierced through with flashes of a feeling harder to pin down that may have something to do with shame, but may equally have something to do with desire not yet dead. Questions of love and ownership preoccupy him, and there is a reason for that. A year ago, he bought a property abroad, in Spain, in Catalonia, on another continent. Property in Spain is not expensive, not off the coastline in Spain's decaying villages. Foreigners by the thousand, Europeans for the most part, but from elsewhere too, have acquired homes of a kind there, pied-à-terre, of whom he is now one. In his case, the move has its practical side. He makes his living as a writer, and in this day and age, a writer can live anywhere, linked electronically to agents and editors, as smoothly from a small village as from a city. Since his youth, he has had a fondness for Spain, the Spain of taciturn pride and old formalities. Does he love Spain? At least love of a country, a people, a way of life is not some newfangled notion. If he is going to spend more and more of his life in Spain, it makes sense to have a place he can call his own, a home where the linen and the kitchenware are familiar, and he doesn't have to clean up other people's messes. Of course, one does not need to own Spanish property to spend time in Spain. One can work perfectly well out of rented accommodation, even out of hotels. Hotels might seem the expensive option, but not when one has done the arithmetic, added up all the incidentals. Hotels, thoughts of love keep coming back, are like passing affairs. One departs, parts company, and that is the end of it. Buying a house may not make economic sense, but it makes a deeper kind of sense. He is in his 50s, if not in the final straight, then coming around the turn leading into the final straight. No more time for playing around, for following whims. The house in Catalonia is no impulse of the moment, no casual fling. On the contrary, it is the consequence of an eminently rational decision-making process. If it resembles a marriage at all, it resembles an arranged marriage, bridegroom matched with bride by a broker, a professional. Yet, even in arranged marriages, man and wife sometimes fall in love. Is it possible that late in life he is going to fall in love with a house he has found for himself in Spain? The house stands in a short street at the edge of the village of Belpuig, overlooking fields of sunflower and corn. It comes with a huge fig tree and a patch of garden where he could, if he chose, grow his own beans and tomatoes. There is a rabbit hutch, too, should his tastes incline to rabbit flesh. The house was built, if he is to believe the agent, in the 13th century. From the reading he has done on the antiquities of Catalonia, that is not impossible. The walls could certainly date back that far. They are a yard thick in places, meant to keep the cold of winter and the heat of summer out. The chiseled stone held together by crumbling mortar that might as well now be sand. In its structure, the house will always be odd. The front double door opens onto a space so cavernous that it is fit to be used only as a garage and workshop, or else as an artist's studio. Up one side, a staircase leads via a hatch to the living quarters and kitchen. The design makes sense only when one recognizes that the core of the house used to be a barn, that the living space was constructed above and around the stabling, so that human beings and cattle could share their blood warmth on the cold upland nights. The house is built into the side of a hill. A drain runs under the floor to bear rainwater away. As for the roof, The tiles are modern, with the stamp of a brickworks in Cervera. But the timbers are so worm-riddled, so powdery with rot, that they might well be centuries old too. Another few decades, and the whole roof will probably come crashing down. But by then, he will be beyond caring. The previous owner, the previous husband, as he thinks of him, was a builder from St. Clements, 30 kilometers away. It was he who fixed up the house in his spare time, enlarging the windows, plastering the walls, replacing the door frames, putting in new wiring, installing a bath and bidet before selling it at a markup. No doubt he has moved on to another house now, some other project in some other village. The locals have not been welcoming. The Spanish he speaks is of a hesitant, bookish variety that gets him nowhere in rural Catalonia, where Castilian is a foreign tongue. He is branded an outsider as soon as he opens his mouth. That is all right. He has no right to expect a welcome. What he hopes for and what he gets is toleration. Even in small villages by now, people are used to outsiders moving in. Foreigners have been buying property in France, in Spain, in Portugal for years. The Spanish authorities have nothing against it. As long as they do not take jobs, as long as they bring in money, there is a place for foreigners. It is the same in his own country, where the best seaside properties have passed into the hands of strangers. He does not necessarily like these strangers with their bird of passage habits, but what do his likes and dislikes matter? His Catalan neighbors, he presumes, feel much the same way about him. They do not necessarily like him. Among themselves, they probably complain about him and his kind. Shopkeepers cheat him where they can, justifying themselves on the grounds that foreigners have too much money and are stupid anyway. But as to actively plotting harm against him, he doubts they would go that far. They will merely do nothing to make him feel at home, just as when he is at home, he does nothing to make the Germans or the English feel at home. During his first months in residence, he spent hours every day working on the exterior. He took down the front door, scraped it, painted it, rehung it. He did the same with the wooden shutters. Though his taste was for other colors, a whole other palette, he followed the color scheme uniform in the village: a pale gray-blue, a deep red, here called basque. He took the door lock to pieces. The mechanism itself was primitive to the point of being laughable. A child could have picked it. Nevertheless, he did not replace it, merely cleaned it, greased it, put it back. In this world, he told himself, locks are symbolic. A lock is here to make a statement about ownership, not to prevent a break-in, should anyone be so antisocial as to wish to break in. He has bought the house belongs to him, but only in a certain sense. In another sense, it still belongs to the village in which it is embedded. Well, he has no ambition to prize the house loose from the village. He does not want it to be anything but what it is. His plan at the beginning was to spend 2 seasons of the year here. Summers he would avoid because they were too hot, winters because they were too cold. Plenty of men have marriages like that, he told himself. Sailors, for instance, spend half their lives at sea. But as the months passed, he found something happening to him. He could not put the house from his mind. He lay awake at night, 5,000 miles away, floating from room to room across the dark and empty interior. It was as though he was sending his soul across the seas, across the mountains, to the village wrapped in sleep, sending it or being called. Even in the daytime, he had visions of involuntary, startling clarity. The rusty horseshoe nailed over the back door, the mold under the pipes in the bathroom, the stain high up on the living room wall where a spider was crushed by a broom blow. There were moments when he was convinced that only by the force of his concentrated attention was the house being saved from inexistence. So here he is, in midsummer, in Catalonia. In the cool of the morning, he climbs onto the roof. On hands and knees with a trowel, he begins to scratch away the moss that has grown between the tiles. From her balcony, 2 doors down the street, an old woman in black watches him. He hopes she approves. A foreigner, but a serious man. That is what he hopes she thinks. He grows geraniums, pink and red, in terracotta pots, and places them on either side of the front door, as the neighbors do. Little attentions, he calls them. Little attentions to the house, like the attentions one pays a woman. If this is marriage, he tells himself, then it is a widow I am marrying, a mature woman set in her ways. Just as I cannot be a different man, so I should not want her to become, for my sake, a different woman, younger, flashier, sexier. By his labors, he is to some extent breaking his unwritten compact with the village. When an outsider moves in and buys property, the compact says, he should bring profit to the local people, buy from the local merchants, give work to the local artisans. The work he is doing on the house belongs by right to those artisans. But on this point, he will not yield. What he is engaged in is more serious than mere upkeep. It is intimate work, work he must do with his own hands. In time, he hopes, the local people will come to understand. The village, of course, has memories of the house from before his time, and before the time of Señor Torres, the jack of all trades from St. Clements. The villagers know, or if they do not know, their parents and aunts and uncles knew, the family that used to live here, the family whose children grew up hating the dark, cramped rooms, the damped walls, the old-fashioned plumbing, and as soon as their parents died, washed their hands of the place, selling it for a song to Señor Torres, who fixed it up and resold it to a foreigner, because foreigners inexplicably prefer old houses and are prepared to pay more than they're worth to own them. When one marries, one cares deeply who one's wife was married to before, even who she slept with before. With a house, one is not supposed to care who preceded one. That is another of the ways in which the analogy between ownership and marriage, houses and wives, is supposed to break down. But not in this case. Between these walls, men and women, generation after generation, lived their intimate lives, talking and quarreling and making love in a language he barely understands, according to habits that are foreign to him. They have left no ghosts behind, none that he can sense. But that does not matter. He broods on them insofar as one can brood on people one has never so much as glimpsed. If he had photographs of them, he would hang them on the walls, dour couples in their dark Sunday best, with their children crouching at their feet, humble as rabbits. Why? Why does he want to remember people he never knew? For a good reason. When his own time here has passed, he does not want to be utterly forgotten. If the village will not remember him, he will die far away after a decent interval. There will appear without explanation a new owner, a new face, and that will be that. Then he hopes, hoping against hope, that in some sense the house itself will bear the memory of him. What it comes down to, astonishingly, is that he wants a relationship with this house in a foreign country, a human relationship, however absurd the idea of a human relationship with stone and mortar might be. For the sake of that relationship with this house and its history and the village as a whole, a village that from the highway looks as though it had been conceived by a single mind and built by a single pair of hands. In return for that relationship, he is prepared to treat the house as one treats a woman, paying attention to her needs and even her quirks, spending money on her, soothing her through her bad times, treating her with kindness. Kindness, fidelity, devotion, service. Not love, not yet, but something like it. A form of marriage between a man growing old and a house no longer young. Thank you.
Our next speaker tonight is Cate Kennedy. Cate is the author of 3 poetry collections, a memoir, a novel, and 2 collections of short stories. Her award-winning titles include Dark Roots and The World Beneath. Tonight, Cate Kennedy is reading Flexion, I hope I've said that right, from her collection Like a House on Fire. Welcome, Cate.
Thank you. Flexion. He misjudged the bank of the dam, people said, when they heard Frank Slovak had overturned his tractor onto himself. Not dead, they said, but might as well be. Caught him straight across his spine. Turning at the embankment, some loose earth, must be looking the other way, and bang, look what happens. His wife found him, they went on, pausing to let their listener visualise this, a nightmare they'd all had, hearing the faint throb of the tractor engine changing as it rolled, either roaring or cutting out. Or else you'd be hanging out the washing maybe and look up to see it in the distance, already on its side, metal glinting, upturned rake tines like fangs. Everyone had imagined sometime making that crazed run across the paddocks, faint with whimpering dread, the air sickeningly still over your head like the eye of a storm, pounding through dust and weeds in that unearthly silence, steeling yourself for what you're going to find. Yeah, his wife, they said finally, nodding, the quiet one. Frank's wife notices the dust floating like a heat mirage as she drives up the track with the weekly shopping. She stares blankly at the silhouette on the horizon for what seems like a long time before she realises it's the huge rear wheel of the tractor she's looking at, the vehicle tipped upside down like an abandoned toy. As she runs, she kicks off her slippery town shoes and feels dry, furrowed earth rising and falling and crumbling under her bare feet all the way to where he's lying. Frank, eyes rolling back to her, collar torn off the shirt she'd just ironed the night before, and shattered glass strewn around him like crushed ice. Turn it off. His voice like a bad phone connection, a robot between locked teeth. Shaking hand into the upside-down cabin, in and around the buckled steering wheel, then turning the key, sliding out the familiar clinking weight of the set into her hand. Post office box key, car, tractor, truck, padlock for fences. They're hot from hanging in the sun. Stunned and slow. She can smell diesel dripping from the tank cap. What's he saying to her now? Phone. She instantly sees the mobile phone where she's left it, on the passenger seat of the car. It's not till she blurts this, tells them that she's running back to phone the ambulance now, and sees him swallow and close his eyes instead of shouting at her, that she realises just how bad it must be. Sees too, as she pulls his shirt up to shade his eyes, that every emotion he's withheld from her for the last 18 years, every flinch and grimace and jerk of the eyebrows and lips is boiling and writhing across his face now. It's as if the locked strongbox inside has burst open and everything in there is rippling free and exorcised to the surface, desperately making its escape. By the time she's run home, phoned for help and returned, 7 minutes there and 8.5 minutes back, the spasms have stopped, and he's lying there with his face as emptied as a ransacked, gaping envelope, eyes closed, doggedly sucking air in and panting it out. Well, you wouldn't believe it, people say when they hear the news. What caught him, what injured him most, was the bloody roll bar. The safety bar that's meant to protect him. You tell that to those dickheads in occupational health and safety. Some say he's crushed his pelvis. Some say he's going to be a quad, but whatever it is, he's stuffed now. You don't bounce back from that. And Frank Slovak, who's a glutton for work and always has been, who's got a temper like a rabid dog and a wife who wouldn't say boo, he's up in the hospital now with tubes coming out of him, and they reckon the next 48 hours are crucial. No, it's a week now. It's a fortnight. He must have fractured his, the vertebrae, the nerves. The man can't feel a thing. Frank's wife feels sympathetic eyes behind her as she wheels a trolley around the supermarket. Women on the verge of saying something but thinking better of it. Anxious not to be seen as nosy. After almost 20 years of near invisibility, the accident gives her an odd kind of glamour. There are casseroles wrapped in foil left at the front door. Anonymous gifts of jam and cake and soap. It's like flowers at a funeral, she thinks. A gracious gesture that comes too late. Sympathy delivered once you're already dead and buried. And all for Frank, she thinks with bitterness. Frank, who'd rather cut off his own hand than be beholden to anyone. Who'd never put himself out for any of these people. Never done them a single spontaneous good turn. Frank, who liked his privacy to the point of glowering, hostile secrecy. The year she had lost the baby, he'd driven her home from the hospital, the big hospital, half an hour away. Not even the local nurses would know that way. And told her, looking straight ahead through the windscreen, we're putting this behind us. No jars of jam then, no lavender soap, not a word spoken or confided, until she'd felt she might go mad with the denial of it. They put it behind them all right. They harnessed themselves to it and dragged it like a black dead weight at their backs. They became its beasts of burden. And not a neighbour in sight then to drop by with a crumb of pity or a listening ear. Frank had decided that nobody was to know. She puts the casseroles in the freezer for when she might need them more and eats at the hospital. And as she sits in the visitor's lounge at the Formica table in the air conditioning, she catches herself almost revelling in the luxury of eating the first meal someone else has cooked for her in years. It's almost like being on a holiday, the way they bring you a form like a menu to fill out and come around with a trolley asking if you want tea or coffee. Nothing to do but wait, they tell her, absolving her. And then Frank, greyer and gaunter by the day, contracts pneumonia. Sitting next to him in the afternoons, dozing fitfully and reading through old magazines, she listens to the laboured gurgle as he fights for breath even as he sleeps. It must be like drowning, she thinks as she listens. just going under, slowly losing oxygen into blackness, like wading into the dam. The deeper you go, the colder it gets. Something you'd almost welcome. She's shocked to acknowledge how resigned she feels to this, how it seems almost their best option considering what prognosis the doctors gave at first. She imagines herself telling people after church, well, you know Frank, he wouldn't have wanted to live that way. It's for the best, really. She thinks about serving those casseroles after the funeral. Something simple at the hall next to the church, something the auxiliary could help her organise. I'm 45, she tells herself, with tentative amazement as she drives home of a night. That's not old. Lots of women in those magazines are 45. They're all getting on with life. At the farm, someone comes without being asked and puts chains on the tractor and pulls it upright and tows it into town for repairs. And someone else, quietly and without fuss, loads the yearling lambs onto their truck and takes them off to the market for her. Let him go, she imagines herself saying, should Frank deteriorate and the hospital staff offer intubation. It's what he would have wanted. It startles her, this shift to being able to refer to him so readily in the past tense, a smooth, logical transition like changing gears. But Frank beats off pneumonia, and the doctors start to say things are stabilising after the steroids, and there might be a partial recovery after all, some limited movement, it's hard to say. And she sits, composing her face into relief and optimism, while inside, truth be known, she feels cheated. Cheated, as she watches Frank lifting a spoon to his face, scowling with a kind of ferocious, vindictive resolve, like he's going to hit someone, relearning it all like an automaton, determined to heave himself back. I'm not going to be a burden on anyone, you hear? Is that clear? He mutters to her when the physios finally leave them alone for the afternoon, and knocks her hand away as she goes to wipe some gravy off his chin. That's Frank all over. Can't hold a fork, but can still find a way to smack her out of the way. It's easier to nod and agree, to pretend to take his advice about what she'd be doing at the farm work. Nearly 2 months pass and she expects any day that one of these rehabilitation workers is going to read him the riot act and tell him he's mad to think he's going to go return to the farm. And this anticipation, this certainty, fills her with suppressed patient hope. Maybe he'll survive. Maybe he's not going to be in hospital the rest of his life, but the argument's over. They'll have to move now, in any case, into town. A little unit or a bungalow, something new, with no steps anywhere because of the wheelchair. She'll be able to walk into town every day to shop for whatever she needs, and there'll probably have to be home help, which would give her breaks. It'd be taken as read that she'd need breaks. They even give her pamphlets explaining what she'll be entitled to. She might even get a carer's pension on top of the insurance and what they get for the farm. New car, maybe. One of those hoists. This daydreaming is halted the day Frank claws himself up onto the machinery at the physiotherapy unit, growling like an animal and swearing a blue streak, his eyes popping with the strain, and she watches in incredulous despair as his left leg jerks itself out and wavers hesitantly above rubber flooring like someone learning to dance. And while the physio shakes her head in admiration, the doctors confer over his x-rays, making up new explanations for her, saying, well, he's recovered a great deal more function than we first anticipated. It's really excellent news. And all the time she's standing there, nodding like a doll, hating him so much she can't trust herself to open her mouth. That afternoon when she goes home, the plumber's there. The same plumber who'd quoted her something impossible last year when she'd asked how much it would cost to bring the toilet inside. Only now, he and his assistant are installing a brand new modular shower unit and sink with chrome railings, telling her it's no trouble, anything for old Frank. We'll have this finished in no time. Get out of your way, Mrs. Slovak. And you tell him hello from Pete and Hardo. the plumber says as he leaves. And tell him Bob Wilkes says he'll get his hay baled for him into the shed, no trouble this week, so don't worry about a thing. And once again, trying to show brightness and gratitude while inside her, choking rage burns like a grass fire, like gasoline, because now any fool can see how it's going to be. Frank, unable to sit at the desk, standing over her, telling her how to do the books, ordering her round and snapping at her, in the ute beside her as she drives, sighing with contempt every time she crunches the gears, unable even to get out and open the gates for her. Frank hovering over her entire working day, badgering her and criticising her and depending on her for everything. And her, running the gauntlet outside church and in town, having to dutifully tell everyone how lucky they'd been. Limited mobility is actually going to suit Frank, she thinks. He's been minimising all his movements for years, barely turning his head to her when she speaks, sitting there stonily in the kitchen, immovable as a mountain, unbending. So now, with his back fused like he's got a poker ram down it, on 1 or 2 sticks or a walking frame, the doctors say, depending on how well his pelvis adapts, it'll be Frank needing her to pull his legs sideways out of the bed and haul him into a sitting position and run for cushions, and there won't be need for home help for that, they won't qualify. The community worker will come to assess them and see how well she can cope, and Frank will tell them he doesn't need help, thanks all the same. He's got all the help he needs. It's marvellous, people will say to her after church, the way God works. This you're doing is all he says when he sees the bathroom. Couldn't wait to go behind my back. Nothing to do with me, Pete Nicol did it. He shoots her a look. What, he just turned up and did it? That'll be the day. Heaves himself forward on his frame to get a better look at the fitting around the sink and grunts dismissively when he can't find anything wrong with it. Better get ready to remortgage the place then, for when his bill comes, it's common knowledge that bloke charged like a wounded bull. He said not to worry about it. She tries not to make her voice sound too enthused, to give him less ammunition. That's a skill doing that. What's through there? He can't jerk his head now, she notices, just his eyes. The new toilet. You're bloody joking. He shoulders past her and inches over there, crab-like. He looks round the door suspiciously, then grunts again. Well, it's left me in the shit now with the council, that's all I can say. They'll be straight on to me about having to pay for an easement. They don't miss a trick, those bastards. Frank, he said he sorted the easement. He left me the permit and papers and everything on the desk. He pivots again, swearing as the wheels on the frame bang into the bath, to find her standing in front of him, waiting for his reaction. It would kill him, she thinks, to show pleasure or relief or excitement. Her loathing is such a pure thing. She experiences a secret visceral pleasure to watch him cornered like this, tormented by something as incomprehensible and enraging as kindness. So who came and dug the trench? He snaps accusingly. That contractor he uses, Ian Harding, isn't it? How much did he charge? I'm telling you, they said not to worry about it. He actually grimaces with discomfort, muttering at her to get out of the way as he shuffles past, bangs out the back door and down the brand new ramp that someone from Rotary came and fitted last week, replacing the back step that had been broken for almost 11 years. At the end of the backyard, in sight of the hay shed, he stops short and stares at his neatly slashed paddocks and stacked bales. It's then she sees what his limited mobility is costing him now, how his neck and head are forced to stay erect while his shoulders sag at a stiff, helpless angle, hands clinging to the brakes of his walking frame, the whole of him fighting against the suppressed tremors that threatened to shake him free of it. Bob Wilkes did it, she calls. But he doesn't turn or respond. She imagines him giving up and toppling, curled there on the ground. She's never seen him curled up, not even when she sat there with him in the dirt, waiting for the ambulance. He'd stayed in control then too, sprawled there, licking his lips every now and then, his eyes losing focus with something like bewilderment as he stared up into the blue, something almost innocent. You just have to do this till I get the hang of it, he mutters as she helps him manoeuvre into the shower. She ignores him and just goes on explaining. Well, now you lower yourself onto the seat using the handrails and back out your walker because you're not supposed to get it wet. Right, I'll be right now. Well, I'll just stay and turn on the taps. See, they're low, they'll put them in there specially. Be easier if I could stand up and reach the soap myself then. I'll look out for one of those soap on a rope things, she says. God, the flesh is hanging off him. His knuckles are white and waxy as they cling to the handles. He's as scared and frail as an old, old man. Scared to turn his head or take one hand off the rail, one misstep away from a nursing home. His hair needs a cut and she decides she'll do it later at the kitchen table. That's better, he says, as she adjusts the hot tap. And she can hear that he's about to say thank you and stops and swallows. But even without the thanks, thinks it's probably the longest conversation they've had for months. Now you need to put the brake locks on this every time you pull up, understand? Don't forget, up with the handrails, on the rubber mat, both hands on the walker handles, then release the brake. I'm not stupid, he mutters, but his eyes are following her every move, the pupils dilated. She gets him dressed into the kitchen, cuts his hair and shaves him. One of the casseroles, defrosted, with rice, he can manage that. Then she tears a page off the pad and lays it down in front of him and places the cordless phone handset next to him. What's this? He says. Phone numbers. You've got some calls to make. She feels a surge of courage as she says it, there on the other side of the table. She taps the list. People to ring and thank. Now you're home. Don't bloody start that nonsense. I didn't ask for any of these do-gooders to come round. Frank, she says, I'm not arguing with you, I'm telling you. If you want another favour done, believe me, we're going to be calling in a few. Ring and let people know how much you appreciate what they've done for you. Or what? He looks strange, fighting to maintain an attitude of derisive scorn as he sits there in his pyjamas, his hair neatly combed and the muscles wasted on him after all those months on his back. What do you reckon? She says, exasperated. We go under. We sell up. And when he looks at her with familiar narrow contempt, she picks up the hand mirror, lying there next to the scissors on the table, and a steady exhilaration pumps through her as she deliberately angles it to face him. Take a good look, she says, and get on that phone. In bed, already planning in her mind the tasks of the next day, she listens to the fan ticking over their heads and feels the forgotten, heavy presence of him lying beside her. She thinks about the physiotherapist at the hospital, lifting Frank's legs and folding them against his body, turning him on his side and gently bending his arms from shoulder to hip. Flexion, she'd called it. Exercises to flex the muscles and keep the memory of limber movement alive in the body, to stop those ligaments and tendons tightening and atrophying away. Just like this, Mr. Slovak, she'd said, that calm and cheerful young woman. You do this yourself, just keep at it. And she'd taken Frank's hand and made his arm describe a slow circle, then flexed the elbow to make it touch his chest, down and back again, over and over, a gesture like a woodenly acted entreaty. Do you want me to leave you a page of instructions on these movements to jog your memory? Frank, submitting hatchet-faced to this procedure, had given his head one slow, stiff shake. If I need a set of instructions to remember that, he said tightly, you may as well carry me out in a box right now. The girl had just laughed indulgently at him, she remembers now. She must send those staff members a card and a present and thank them for all their forbearance. She hears Frank exhale, then silence before a ragged, hiccuping intake of breath. She glances over and makes out the shape of him in the moony dimness, flat on his back and still as a tree, arms at his sides like a soldier at attention and crying soundlessly, eyes screwed shut and face contorted into a mask. His mouth is a black hole of terror. Glinting tears leak into the furrows of discontent etched around his eyes and nose. pour down to wet his freshly barbed hair. She's never seen this, and it's mortifying. They'd warned her about acute pain, and she wonders about getting up and giving him some tablets, but she's so shocked, all she can do is turn her head back to look up at the ceiling and speak in the shame of her scrutiny, and they lie rigidly side by side. When you stood up to run home and call the ambulance, he says, I thought, well, now I've got 10 minutes. Now would be the good time to die while you weren't there. That's what I could give you. Lying there, she has a sense of how it is suddenly, willing your limbs to move but being unable to lift them. The terrible treasonous distance between them that must be traversed, the numbed heaviness of her arm. But she finally reaches over and takes his hand. Doesn't even feel like his anymore. The working calluses vanished into soft smoothness like a beach after a stormy, receding tide. She wouldn't recognise his hand now, especially not the way the fingers grip hers. Squeeze my hand, the physio had said. That's good, Mr. Slovak. She lies there now feeling the pulse in her husband's pitifully thin wrist under her little finger. She understands better than anyone, she thinks, the painful stretch of sinew, the crack of dislocation, remembers herself running back over the paddocks, flying barefoot over stones and earth, looking down distractedly in the ambulance later to notice the dried blood on her feet. How fast she'd run, and how much faster she'd run back. Now in the dark bed, she raises her arm with Frank's and gently flexes both her elbows together. She places his hand wordlessly, determinedly over his heart and holds it there. Thanks.
Our next speaker tonight is David Malouf, an internationally acclaimed and award-winning author of novels, short stories, essays and poetry. His most recent books are A First Place, Being There and The Writing Life. Tonight, David Malouf is reading Closer, first published in his collection Dream Stuff.
There was a time, not so long ago, when we saw my Uncle Charles twice each year, at Easter and Christmas. He lives in Sydney, but would come like the rest of us to eat at the big table at my grandmother's after church. We're Pentecostals. We believe that all that is written in the book is clear truth without error. Just as it is written, so it is. Some of us speak in tongues, and others have the gift of laying on hands. This is a grace we are granted because we live as the Lord wishes in truth and charity. My name is Amy, but in the family I am called A, and my brothers Mark and Ben call me Rabbit. Next year, when I am 10 and can think for myself and resist the influences, I will go to school like the boys. In the meantime, my grandmother teaches me. I am past long division. Uncle Charles is the eldest, the firstborn. When you see him in family photographs with my mother and Uncle James and Uncle Matt, he is the blondest. His eyes have the most sparkle to them. My mother says he was always the rebel. She says, trouble is, he never grew up. He lives in Sydney, which Grandpa Morpeth says is Sodom. This is the literal truth, as Aaron's rod, which he threw at Pharaoh's feet, did literally become a serpent, and Jesus turned water into wine. The Lord destroyed Sodom, and he is destroying Sydney. but with fire this time that is slow and invisible. It is burning people up, but you don't see it because they burn from within. That's the beginning. Later, they burn visibly, and the sight of the flames blistering and scorching and blackening and wasting to the bone is horrible. Because Uncle Charles lives in Sodom, we do not let him visit. If we did, we might be touched. He is one of the fools in Israel. That is what Grandpa Morpeth calls him. He has practiced abominations. 3 years ago, he confessed this to my grandpa and grandma and my Uncle James and Matt, expecting them to welcome his frankness. Since then, he is banished. He is as water spilled on the ground that cannot be gathered up again. So that we will not be infected by the plague he carries, Grandpa has forbidden him to come onto our land. In fact, he is forbidden to come at all, though he does come at Easter and Christmas, when we see him across the home paddock fence. He stands far back on the other side, and my grandfather and grandmother and the rest of us stand on ours, on the grass slope below the house. We live in separate houses, but on the same farm, which is where my mother and Uncle James and Uncle Matt and Uncle Charles, when he was young, grew up, and where my uncles, Matt and James, still work. They are big men with hands swollen and scabbed from the farm work they do, and burnt necks and faces, and feet with toenails grey from sloshing about in rubber boots in the bales. They barge about the kitchen at 5 o'clock in their undershorts, still half asleep, then sit waiting for Grandma to butter their toast and pour their tea. Then they go out to milk the herd, hose out the bales, drive the cows to pasture, and cut and stack lucerne for winter feed. Sometimes my brothers and I go with them. They are blonde like Uncle Charles, but not so blonde, and the hair that climbs out above their singlets under the Adam's apple is dark. They are jokers. They like to fool about. They are always teasing. They have a wild streak, but have learned to keep it in. My mother says they should marry and have wives. Working a dairy farm is a healthy life. The work is hard, but good. But when I grow up, I mean to be an astronaut. Ours is a very pleasant part of the country. We are blessed. The cattle are fat, the pasture's good. The older farmhouses, like my grandfather's, are large, with many rooms and wide verandas, surrounded by camphor laurels and bunyas and hoop pines and Scotch firs. Sodom is far off, but one of the stations on the line is at the bottom of our hill, and many trains go back and forth. My Uncle Charles, however, comes by car. His car is silver. It is a BMW and costs an arm and a leg. It has sheepskin seat covers and a hands-free phone. When Uncle Charles is on the way, he likes to call and announce his progress. The telephone rings in the hallway. You answer. There are pips. Then Uncle Charles says, in a jokey kind of voice, "This is GAY 437 calling. I am approaching Balladila." The air's roaring through the car makes his voice sound weird, like a spaceman's, far off. It is like a spaceship homing in. Later, he calls again. "This is GAY 437, the voice announces. "I am approaching Warhope." "Don't any one of you pick up that phone," my grandfather orders. "But Grandpa," my brother Ben says, "it might be Mrs. McTaggart." Mrs. McTaggart is a widow and our neighbor. "It won't be," Grandpa says. "It will be him." He is a stranger to us, as if he had never been born. This is what Grandpa says. But Grandma says nothing. She was in labor for 22 hours with Uncle Charles. He was her first. For her, it can never be as if he had never been born, even if she too has cast him out. I heard my mother say this. My father told her to shush. You can see his car coming from far off. You can see it approaching. It is very like a spaceship, silver and fast. It flashes. You can see its windscreen catching the sun as it rounds the curves between the big Norfolk Island pines of the golf course and the hospital. Then its flash between the trees along the river. When it pulls up on the road outside our gate, there is a humming like something from another world. Then all 4 windows go up of their own accord, all together, with no one winding, and Uncle Charles swings the driver's door open and steps out. He is taller than Uncle James or Uncle Matt, taller even than Grandpa, and has what the book calls beautiful locks. They are blonde. Bleached, my grandfather tells us, peroxide. He is tanned and has the whitest teeth I have ever seen. The corruption is invisible. The fire is under his clothes and inside him, hidden beneath the tan. The dogs arrive yelping, all bunched together. They go bounding over the grass to the fence, leaping up on one another's backs with their tails wagging to lick his hands as he reaches in to fondle them. "Don't come any closer," my grandfather shouts. "We can see you from there." His voice is gruff, as if he had suddenly caught cold, which in fact he never does, or as if a stranger was speaking for him. Uncle Charles has broken his heart. Grandpa has cast him out, as you cast off a limb so that the body can go on living. But he likes to see that he is still okay, that it has not yet begun. And in fact, he looks wonderful as far as you can see, no marks. Once, when he got out of the car, he had his shirt off. His chest had scoops of shadow, and his shoulders were golden and so smooth they gave off a glow. His whole body had a sheen to it. Uncle James and Uncle Matt are hairy men like Esau. They are shaggy, but his chest and throat and arms were like an angel's, smooth and polished as wood. You can see the whiteness of his teeth, and when he takes off his sunglasses, the sparkle of his eyes, and his smoothness and the blondness of his hair, but you do not see the marks. This is because he does not come close. My grandmother stands with her hands clasped and breathes, but does not speak. Neither does my mother, though I have heard her say to my father in an argument, "Charlie's just a big kid. He never grew up. He was always such fun to be with." "Helen," my father said. I know my grandmother would like Uncle Charles to come closer so that she could really see how he looks. She would like him to come in and eat. There is always enough, we are blessed. There is an ivory ring with his initial on it, C, in the dresser drawer with the napkins. And when we count the places at table, she pretends to make a mistake out of habit and sets one extra, but not the ring. The place stays empty all through our meal. No one mentions it. I know it is Grandpa Morpeth's heart that is broken because he has said so, but it is Grandma Morpeth who feels it most. She likes to touch. She is always lifting you up and hugging. She does not talk much. When we go in to eat and take up our napkins and say grace and begin passing things, he does not leave. He stays there beside his car in the burning sunlight. Sometimes he walks up and down outside the fence and shouts. It is hot. You can feel the burning sweat on him. Then after a time, he stops shouting and there is silence. Then the door of his car slams and he roars off. I would get up if I was allowed and watch the flash of metal as he takes the curves around the river, past the hospital, then the golf course. But by the time everyone is finished and we are allowed to get down, he is gone. There is just the wide river pasture, open and empty, with clouds making giant shadows and the trees by the river in a silvery shimmer, all their leaves humming a little and twinkling as they turn over in a breeze that otherwise you might not have seen. Evil is in the world because of men and their tendency to sin. Men fell into error, so there is sin, and because of sin there is death. Once the error has got in, there is no fixing it, not in this world. But it is sad that it is hard. Grandpa says it has to be, that we must do what is hard to show that we love what is good and hate what is sinful. And the harder the thing, the more love we show him. But I don't understand about love any more than I do about death. It seems harder than anyone can bear to stand on one side of the fence and have Uncle Charles stand there on the other, as if he was already dead and death was stronger than love, which surely cannot be. When we sit down to our meal with his chair in empty space, the food we eat has no savor. I watched Grandpa Morpeth cut pieces of meat with his big hands and push them between his teeth and chew and swallow, and what he is eating, I know, is ashes. His heart is closed on its grief. And that is what love is. That is what death is. Us inside at the table, passing things and eating, and him outside as if he had never been born, dead to us, but shouting. The silver car with its dusky windows that roll up of their own accord, and the phone in there in its cradle, is the chariot of death, and the voice announcing, I am on the way, I am approaching Gloucester, I am approaching Taree. What can that be but the angel of death? The phone rings in the house. It rings and rings. We pause at the sink in the middle of the washing up, my grandmother and mother and me, that do not look at one another. My grandfather says, don't touch it, let it ring. So it keeps ringing for a while, then stops like the shouting. This Easter, for the first time, he did not come. We waited for the telephone to ring, and I went out just before we sat down to our meal to look for the flash of his car along the river. Nothing, just the wide green landscape lying still under the heat with not a sign of movement in it. That night, I had a dream, and in the dream, he did come. We stood below the veranda and watched his car pull up outside the fence. The smoky windows went up as usual. But when the door swung open and he got out, it was not just his shirt he had taken off, but all his clothes, even his shoes and socks, everything except his sunglasses. You could see his bare feet in the grass, large and bony, and he glowed. He was smooth all over like an angel. He began to walk up to the fence. When he came to it, he stood still a moment, frowning. Then he put his hand out and walked on, walked right through it to our side where we were waiting. What I thought in the dream was that the lumpy, coarse-stemmed grass was the same on both sides, so why not? If one thick blade didn't know any more than another that the fence was there, why should his feet? When he saw what he had done, he stopped, looked back at the fence, and laughed. All round his feet, little daisies and gaudy, bright pink clover flowers began to appear, and the petals glowed like metal, molten in the sun but cool, and spread uphill to where we were standing, and were soon all around us and under our shoes. Insects, tiny grasshoppers, sprang up and went leaping, and glassy snails, no bigger than your little fingernail, hung on the grass stems, quietly feeding. He took off his sunglasses, looked down at them, and laughed, then looked across to where we were, waiting. I had such a feeling of lightness and happiness. It was as if my bones had been changed into clouds, just as the tough grass had been changed into flowers. I knew it was a dream, but dreams can be messages. The feeling that comes with them is real, and if you hold onto it, you can make the rest real. So I thought, if he can't come to us, I must go to him. So this is what I do. I picture him, there on the other side of the fence, naked, his feet pressing the springy grass. Stretch out your hand, I tell him, like this. I stretch my hand out. If you have faith, the fence will open for you, as the sea did before Moses when he reached out his hand. He looks puzzled. No, I tell him, don't think about it. Just let it happen. It has not happened yet, but it will. Then, when he is close at last, when he has passed through the fence and is on our side, I will stretch out my hand and touch him just under the left breast, and he will be whole. He will feel it happening to him and laugh. His laughter will be the proof. I want this more than anything. It is my heart's desire. Each night now, I lie quiet in the dark and go over it. The winding up of the smoky windows of the chariot of death, the swinging open of the door, him stepping out and looking towards me behind his sunglasses, me telling him what I tell myself. Open your heart now. Let it happen. Come closer, closer. See? Now, reach out your hand. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Well, what a treat to hear from these three amazing writers. There will be a book signing at the back of the room as soon as we get off the stage now. But please join me in thanking John Coetzee, Cate Kennedy, and David Malouf.